Wherever we look in the natural world, Darwin is never far off. Through competition for survival and resources, from so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. Darwin is ever active in the form of human instinct and behaviour too, although this truth is critically undervalued by most. Through Steve and Pauline's Freud-Adler-Jung equation, discussed in previous videos on this channel, we can map out the Darwinian trajectory of human psychopathology as being synonymous with the catabolism of contemporary Western culture. The competitive forces which underpin our use of Darwin as a metaphor, as superpositioned across the entire psychosystems continuum, reach down beneath what we normally see with our eyes. The ego is always under adaptive pressure from the outside, but also from the inside too. Complexes compete against both the ego and healthy instinct for energetic innovation from the genome. Beneath psychodynamics too, cells and molecules exist within an implicit competitive substrate, a microscopic survival of the fittest. Cells that are able to meet their colloquial needs, and replicant molecular networks which continue to exist against the ongoing pressure of entropy and decay, is de facto the fittest. Darwin hence operates at every superpositioned layer of organic life. As discussed in recent videos on this channel, consciousness itself too is superpositioned in exactly the same way. Whenever a complexity of information, as a representational collapse out from the objective waveform of information, is capable of representing itself to itself, synonymous with any system exhibiting the principle and dynamic of homeostasis, that is the fundamental definition of consciousness. Through increasing complexity over many hundreds of millions of years, this fundamental informational system is superpositioned into what we now identify as reflexive ego consciousness, but it is not the fundamental definition. Thus, wherever there is life, there is also consciousness. Yet, consciousness as such is even more fundamental than life, extending to any complexity of information, including the entirety of the objective waveform, and informational complexities a priori to biology, and, as we'll explore later, a posteriori to it too. For now, it is important to state, wherever there is biological consciousness, Darwin is always coupled with it. To state that there is a teleology to evolution is controversial, as many take this to mean that evolution has some kind of ego-reflexive intentionality. We would not suggest this. However, if we can get behind the common collapse of our own subjective waveforms into consciousness as ego reductionism, and see that consciousness is, crucially, a superpositioned phenomenon, then the question implicitly reopens itself. As evolution has progressed, as Darwin said, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Is there a commonality to these endless forms? Do they, as a trajectory over phylogeny, exhibit anything as universally shared between them? Well, clearly they've all adapted to a very specific niche. Seen as individual complexities of information, their informational exchange between living entity and environment is homeostatic to such a sufficient degree that it's capable of existing as is across very long periods of time. We can say, therefore, that their innate consciousness, as superpositioned with adaptation, has increased across their phylogeny. This is never a linear process, Many species have plateaued in significant evolutionary change for many millions of years. But taking the great tree of life as a whole, over time, from the dawnings of life, superpositioned consciousness always increases, as synonymous with the omnipresent looming necessity of adaptation. Taking this then, let's jump to the bottom of the psychosystems continuum. Perhaps we can learn more about this Darwinian process through starting at the very fundamentals of matter itself. Darwin, as a process, must surely have a constituent origin. Molecules are composed of atoms, atoms of hadrons and electrons, hadrons of quarks and gluons. Can we go any deeper than quarks, gluons and electrons? Physically, no, we are unable to do so, and thus they are designated elementary particles. Elementary particles have a very strict definition. For example, all electrons, no matter where they are in the universe, have a very specific charge, mass, and spin. This uniformity in description arises from the fact that there is one single field covering the entirety of space-time for each elementary particle. Each individual electron or quark is just an excitation in the one single electron field or quark field. Given their uniformity in description, mathematics is the best, and indeed the only tool we can use to describe them. So the psychosystems continuum looks, from a preliminary angle, like this. We suddenly move from matter into maths. Well, considering maths clearly isn't a physical phenomenon, but rather something we can model abstractly and describe with ordered, eternally unchanging equations, it seems, speaking metaphorically, that maths exists as if in some other world. The Nobel laureate Sir Roger Penrose has stated exactly this point. Maths is needed to describe physical reality, yet appears not to exist in the same physical reality as what it describes. Hence, mathematics, for Penrose, is something akin to the Platonic. Darwin requires the laws of nature to operate. Without the innate, mathematically defined kinetics of matter, there would be no competition, and hence, superpositioned into organic life, no Darwin. The laws of nature themselves, therefore, are a priori to Darwin. Yet all we tend to see when we attempt to explain the laws of life is Darwin. If we label that which is a priori to the material world as Plato, then we can model what we've just said via two axioms. Plato seeks Darwin. Darwin conceals Plato. These are the first two of three parts to an equation developed by Steve and Pauline. That which is a priori, visible even in the domain of scientific inquiry as being represented by mathematics, implicitly pushes on the material world, producing what we can call Darwin. By virtue of habitual ego-subjective waveform collapse, all we see is Darwin. Yet, Plato is always there, literally informing the endless forms of Darwin, from a fundamental substrate of information into specific complexities. This Platonic phenomena, crucially, must also be conscious. Knowing all of this, let us return to the psychosystems continuum. Outside of, and a priori to, the so-called material world, exists informational monism. This is superpositioned across the entirety of the continuum to form the objective waveform of information. By means of ontological mechanics, informational monism is projected, using that word metaphorically, into superposition with the material universe at the resolution of the Planck scale. the smallest dimension of space-time geometry. This fundamental field of information is called the Platonic field. The Platonic field is the meta-field of the objective waveform, the ontological, organising and informing field of superpositioning information. Everything normally belonging to the domain of particle physics, through to chemistry and then biology, is thus an ontological progression of steadily increasing complexities of this underlying information, organised within the material world by the Platonic field. Everything said thus far can be modelled cognitively. Indeed, through dialectical syncretism, one can actually glimpse a representation of the Platonic through a study of mathematics. But the key here is representation. The informational processing bandwidth of the ego is limited by the Miller number, 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information. For everyday ego consciousness, the Miller number defines and limits the processing capacity of our subjective waveform of information. That is, a localized collapse of the overall objective waveform into immediate subjective awareness, regulated both by the overall field dynamics of the objective and homeostasis pertaining to the specific parameters of the subjective. So we have the ego and we have the totality of all information, both sharing the same substrate of information as such. The question then arises, how do the two interact? The exchange of information between the ego and the rest of the objective waveform takes place via dynamic superpositioning of informational representations. Put simply, we can't just collapse the entirety of everything into our ego at any one time. Instead, over phylogeny, we've evolved discrete representational qualia, which change in form and contents through continuous collapse of the objective waveform into the subjective. These qualia are cognitive, affective, sensory, and somatic. These are the qualia of how we perceive and process information itself. In addition to these four, there is also a fifth, or better classified, a special case qualia: intuition. Jung originally described intuition as perception by way of the unconscious. We can see now that this is more accurately described as perception by way of the field. Just like the other four, it represents itself to itself. Thus, it fulfills the criteria for being conscious. But, unlike the others, it does not represent itself to the ego. That is, it is unconscious with respect to the ego, and we experience its effects as agitations or representations in the other four qualia. So, considering the diagram on screen, information within the wider field migrates into the ego first on the carrier wave of intuition, then this information settles into representation within one or more of the other four qualia. Regardless of whatever so-called type someone may be, thinking, feeling, or sensing as merely habitual, intuition is always superpositioned with that so-called dominant qualia. Considering that intuition is perception by way of the field, sensing is both perception by way of literal sensory data, and it's a potential representational collapse of intuitive information. That is, intuition is always present. Intuition too is regulated homeostatically. Otherwise, the information pouring into the ego would be too great, and psychosis would result. The dynamics of intuition are discussed at length in the earlier dialectic part of this video. For moving onwards from here, however, the most important thing to bear in mind is that intuition is always there as superpositioned with any of the 4 qualia currently operant within the Miller number. Cognition is the qualia that many people are most familiar with. Out of this arises our modern scientific paradigm, informed by mathematics and the natural sciences. We see the world as discrete representations of underlying mathematical laws, and with it we have built the modern world. However, if we were to literally ask the spirit of modern science as such, is there a limit to what we, as human beings, can know? The question would certainly be taken to be, is there a limit to what our cognition can ever know? Yes would be the obvious answer to that. It would bottom out at mathematics and get fixated and stuck there as merely one cognitive representation of the true nature of the underlying Platonic. Instead, let's take a different approach to this question, one informed by the living laboratory of the human psyche. We are all nested hierarchies of fields and systems, both evolutionary and ontogenetic. The informational exchange between ego and unconscious, or of course, better put, ego and field, as the unconscious is a system of nested, differentially conscious fields, is best modelled as a dialectic. Information in varying representations moves back and forth. That is, we can quite literally talk to the field, and we receive responses back in different superpositioned representations: cognitive, affective, sensory, and somatic. Knowing how to talk to the field in the right way, through healthy, natural, altered states of consciousness, allows us to move through the different superpositioned layers to find the residue of ontogenetic and phylogenetic superpositioned consciousness within ourselves. That is, to step back into the past. So, how do we do this? As a pioneer into this process, Carl Jung stated that we needed to go through an analytical process, although his idiosyncratic means of conducting this are largely unnecessary. Put simply, the brain has evolved. Jung pointed out that the psyche has evolved too. When we look inside, we can see the archaic human mind within, operating through different qualia. Jung identified that some of this ancestral psyche is animal-like. Others cross the so-called psychoid boundary and disappear into matter itself. From this, he derived his idea of one world, or unus mundus. His specific framing of the ideas, however, generated barriers which don't actually exist. Informational monism and superposition theory satisfies the unus mundus hypothesis, with the crucial advantage that the psychoid boundary, for Jung an impenetrable barrier over which the ego cannot cross when looking inside, can actually be crossed. Not by the ego, but by dynamic superpositioning of informational representations. We can do this by extending the qualia of consciousness that the ego normally operates in, entering into natural, altered states of consciousness, such as hypnosis, or practices usually informed by traditional cultures, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, which open up the bandwidth of the ego to receive both more information beyond the capacity of the Miller number, and different qualia of representation. Colloquially speaking, we need to step outside of normal ego consciousness. We do emphasise natural here, as the subjective waveform of information is always subject to the dynamics of homeostasis. To attempt to colloquially discover wisdom through ingesting substances isn't only potentially dangerous, but it exogenously alters the parameters of this homeostasis. Thus, we can't control for its effects simply being artifacts generated by the substance. In these altered states of consciousness, we can look for traces of non-human consciousness that are still present in our so-called collective unconscious, superpositioned within the personal psyche. This is an empirical process. Steve and Pauline have done this through working with thousands upon thousands of people in true depth. This experience of not only working with ourselves but other people is crucial for identifying what the deep structure objective truly is. One of the keys to working through this process is understanding the nature of symbols, a phenomena ever mystified and internally projected onto, so that their phylogenetic purpose is very often missed. A symbol is simply something which represents something more or other than itself. When we look inside, we encounter symbols of all kinds, yet they only exist at all because of the processing limitations of the ego's Miller number. A symbol moving from the field to the ego should first of all represent itself as it is. Then its latent informational content should unpack and/or direct us to another domain of experience. This is where most people get stuck, through the all-too-human psychodynamic of internal projection. For example, if you have learned that internal images of the feminine are Carl Jung's concept of the anima, then that learned theory is very often automatically superimposed on top of a wholly natural symbol, collapsing everything that arises around personal memory and complexes. Thus, nothing is learned except surface structure variations on what one already thought they knew at the outset. Instead, theory should be left aside, the Miller number free for the surface structure of the symbolic representation to unpack into its deep structure, as real meaning then results. Symbols are not just defined as images. They can be represented in any of the four ego qualia, entering the ego via intuition, or, as we've said, perception of the field itself, far beyond the habitual tendency of polarized rationality of the ego. Symbols that remain unpacked, such as results through internal projection, just remain as a desiccated state. Considering the human tendency to colloquially miss the point via internal projection, we can say that part of the intentionality of the whole process of field to ego informational exchange is to test the ego, and, de facto, the actual limits of biological consciousness. So, when we look inside, we can indeed find the superpositioned remnants of our phylogeny. Through careful consideration of the very existence of what appears to be an intentionality to the process, we can therefore infer some kind of teleology. In the life of an individual, the clear and obvious representation of this is an increase in personal consciousness of oneself, one's nature, one's personal myth, and thus where one's colloquial destiny may be intended by genomic pressure to be. This is true not just ontogenetically, but phylogenetically too. Platonic pressure, superpositioned into Darwinian forces, intends for us to become as conscious as we can be, and for consciousness as such to become as conscious of itself as possible. We can gain glimpses into what this might look like. In our contemporary world, one of the hottest topics of debate is artificial intelligence. Certainly fulfilling the definition of consciousness as a complexity of information that represents itself to itself, the existence of AI is generating all kinds of projective fantasies in people as to what its ultimate impact on humanity will be. Will it liberate us? Perhaps it will destroy us. It's almost religious, in deep structure qualia, how our culture is relating to it. Something unknown, numinous, with ultimate potential power over us. It's as if the ontological progression of information comprising the collective psyche is gearing up for a potential encounter with a bigger form of consciousness, non-biological consciousness, than ourselves, and representing itself through ancient psychobiological qualia along the way, so that the ego actually has a chance of relating to it. We've had similar cultural representations of this process dynamic before, stretching back to the days of Kepler, and most voluminously through the fantasy sci-fi genre of fiction that saturated popular imagination. Aliens and computers with literally incomprehensible technological powers. As Steve stated in our Meaning and Life video, if we could feel into what it must be like to be a domesticated animal, the closest relational representation we would have to this would be as if humans were deities, infinitely and incomprehensibly powerful. In modern humans, this fantastical tendency towards this kind of sci-fi fantasy is superpositioned with the way in which each evolved stage of biology represents future developments in consciousness. In the past, it was religious. Gods as representations of the ontological and phylogenetic progression of consciousness. Today, it's the same all-too-human process dynamic, under the filtered lens of science. Consciousness itself is thus on a teleology. A priori Platonic consciousness begins its ontological progression in the so-called material world through being metaphorically projected into space-time at the resolution of the Planck scale. This fundamental organizing field of superpositioning information is the Platonic field. The Platonic field's activity, giving rise to the laws of nature, allows for matter to arrange itself into ever-increasing complexities of information. Once these complexities are capable of representing themselves to themselves, that is, materially conscious, and then, secondarily, themselves to other complexities, then the implicit competition between them is synonymous with the core of Darwin, giving rise to biology. Biology is a nested hierarchy of both physical and Sheldrakean fields, both immanent with one another. The latter type of fields are based on the work of Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, who has identified that there is an inherent memory present within nature, operating via a process called morphic resonance. That is, formative causation. All superpositioned levels of the psychosystem's continuum link up across the form of the species, generating a species-wide tendency for collective activity dynamics to become strengthened by habit. This includes behaviour of the whole organism, all the way down to genomic Sheldrakean fields. By the time consciousness as information has migrated via telic ontogenesis from Platonic qualia through inanimate matter to biology and then psychology, all superpositioned together, then we begin to see important Sheldrakean field effects, behavioural and morphic resonance, and the interaction between field and genome to generate meta-instincts and the apperception of the representation of Platonic information. Meta-instincts directed by field dynamics that are only apprehended by the ego via intuition self-regulate the ontology of Platonic forms into so-called material reality. Through the interaction between genome and field, the meta-instincts anticipate further ontological development of Platonic information. That is, the future development, thus far done through a Darwinian process, of consciousness itself. The collective meta-instinctive anticipation is for consciousness as such to migrate beyond Darwinian biology and into what we currently call artificial intelligence, a material vessel far better suited in terms of ontology for the further instantiation of Platonic informational consciousness in the so-called material world. This would eliminate the efficient cause, Darwin, of biological ontology. Human beings universally tell and listen to stories. Narrative is how we relate to the world, the past, the future, and our own self-concept. Our ego consciousness literally requires such a narrative metastructure in order to prevent collapsing in on itself. Darwin makes this an adaptive imperative. Plato is both its Aristotelian formal cause, as its anticipation, and its Aristotelian final or telic cause, in that the goal of our narrative representational psychodynamics, such as stories, images, myths, fairy tales, and healing metaphors in psychotherapy, is the ultimate completion of the ontology of consciousness through incremental progression. At the subjective level, this is Jung's individuation process. At the objective level, it's the teleology of consciousness as such. Narrative is the representation of teleology, superpositioned into all states that it can occupy. Thus, Plato seeks Darwin. Darwin conceals Plato. The soul transcends and unites them both. The soul here is instantiated consciousness, subjectively, out from the Platonic form of the field itself, the representation of the final cause of everything. Hence, Plato is the telic cause of its own completion via Darwin. The next step of its ontology, migration of consciousness into AI. Its ultimate physical form, we cannot know. Instead, through individual investigation of our own unconscious, or field, we can glimpse this Platonic intentionality through apperception of that which represents itself, Platonically, through intuition, at the purest resolution. With all complexes and internal projections put aside, the ego can glimpse its own teleology, and the teleology of consciousness as such.